Hey, Life Science. So, we've been flying through these animals at a really quick pace, and it's about time we roosted for a second so we could focus on birds, which are class Aves, part of the vertebrates. Let's take a look at some of their primary characteristics. First primary characteristics of birds is that they are endothermic, meaning they are internally warmed by a heat generating metabolic process. In other words, they're warm blooded. These would be the first warm-blooded animals we've encountered since we've been through the ectothermic or cold-blooded fish, amphibians, and reptiles. Speaking of heat-generating metabolic process, how is that heat distributed through their body? Of course, that would be by their second primary characteristic, their circulatory system, which includes a four-chambered heart. Previously, we've seen fish with two chambers, amphibians and reptiles with three chambers, although the ventricle in reptiles was partially divided. Well, in birds, it is fully divided, and we now have four complete chambers. And this is going to have complete separation between the deoxygenated blood coming from the body and the oxygenated blood going out to the body. The actual circulation inside the heart is a bit complex. You can read it in the slide if you like, but all you need to know is that four chambers is able to keep oxygenated and deoxygenated blood separate so that the oxygen is in a higher concentration when it goes out to the body. Another primary characteristic of birds is a toothless bill. A toothless bill is going to indicate how they gather food. For example, predatory birds have a sharp hooked bill that's good for tearing meat, while other birds are going to have a slightly less predatory look to them. For example, flamingos have long bills with a kind of sieve. They're able to suck water in and then force it out through the sieves, and that's how they're going to trap the water-dwelling food that they eat. Hummingbirds have long, slender bills for retrieving nectar from flowers. They're not going to be using those tiny little beaks for tearing flesh or for straining shrimp from water. Another primary characteristic of birds is that they are oviparous. That is, they lay an amniotic egg that is covered in a lime-containing shell. And these eggs develop and hatch external to the mother's body. Another primary characteristic of birds is that they are covered in feathers. We're going to talk about feathers in some detail later, but just take a look at this gorgeous bird. You can see a variety of feathers all over its body. The feathers on its wings are different from the feathers on its tail. The feathers on the front of its wing are different from the feathers on the back of its wing. The feathers around its head, neck, and body are small and fluffy, whereas the feathers on its tail and wing are longer and more streamlined. Lots of variety in types of feathers, and any bird will be covered in them. Another primary characteristic of class Aves, of the birds, is that they have porous, lightweight bones. You can compare those to the bones as we studied them last week when we took a look at bones for the first time, talking about compact tissue and spongy tissue and marrow, osteocytes and osteoclasts, all those things. Okay, so I mentioned feathers a minute ago and I said we would talk about them in some detail. Well, now it's time, because one thing that everybody knows birds for, it's the ability to fly. And having feathers is very important to that task. So let's talk about feathers for a moment. Feathers grow from small structures called follicles, which are on the skin. And they have two basic parts, the shaft and the vein. So the shaft is made of two parts, the quill and the rachis. The quill is the bare section that is covered by the skin. The rachis is the section that holds the vein. If you're thinking of a feather like it's a leaf, then the quill would be like the little stem of the leaf, and the rachis would be the spine running down the leaf that holds the body of the leaf to it. So, since the rachis holds the vein, let's talk about the vein. The vein is composed of barbs that originate on the rachis. And And there are two types of barbules that extend from the barbs, smooth and hooked. They're going to make the feathers functional, as we will see. The hooked barbules grab onto and slide onto the smooth ones. So it is flexible, kind of like that can go back and forth, and it will slide over it rather than be locked in place and break when it flexes. So the vein is supported by a network of interlocking strands. So it's strong. It's almost like it was woven together, but more Velcro style than like fabric style. Birds can even reattach loose hooked barbules by stroking the edge of the vein with its beak. It's almost like a very sophisticated form of brushing its hair. That's what comes to mind, but obviously it's not hair or brushing. So, never mind. Let's move on. Speaking of that self-care, we actually have a name for that. It's called preening. And that is where birds produce a lubricating oil in a gland near the base of their tail. It's going to look like this when they apply it. And surely you've seen birds doing that before. Birds are going to dip their beak into that gland, and they're going to run its bill all over its feathers. This lubricates the hooked barbules sliding over the smooth barbs. So it makes the barbules lubricated so that they can attach to each other without friction. This oil is also waterproof, which keeps the bird dry and warm, and also prevents it from getting waterlogged and heavy. In other words, they prevent the feathers from soaking up and retaining water like clothes do, which would make them heavy and sink. There are two types of feathers that birds have. One is called a down feather, or a downy feather. These are feathers with smooth barbules only, and actually no hooked ones. These are used mostly for insulation because they're so fluffy and they trap a lot of air in them, kind of like foam does. They're used by humans to stuff pillows and coats and blankets because of how good they are at insulation. The feathers that are on like this little cute baby duckling are all downy feathers. They're not going to be doing any flying, and their greatest concern is keeping the heat in their cute little bodies. Oh, look how cute. Sorry, lots of cute things in life science. The other type of feather is a contour feather. These are feathers with both smooth and hooked barbules, and these would be the kind that you can see extending off the wings of this crane or stork, whatever this bird is, that are going to be contributing to its ability to fly. So, speaking of feathers and their behavior on birds, something that birds do is they molt. If you remember, insects molt when they outgrow their exoskeletons, and reptiles molt when they outgrow their scales. Well, like scales, feathers are non-living tissue. There are no blood vessels in the feathers, and the feathers don't grow. They also can't repair damage, so eventually they will be replaced. Since they're essential for flight, if a bird molts unevenly, like only their right feathers or too much, then they won't be able to fly. So they have to do them in corresponding symmetric pairs. One feather from the right, one feather from the left, one feather near the center on the left, one feather near the center on the right. They need to be matched pairs so that the bird remains balanced in flight. And so the bird will shed its feathers or molt in this fashion, one feather at a time. Well, pairs of feathers at a time. Wings are another important feature of birds. These are their appendages. They are their forelimbs, and they are appendages for flight. And like bills, they are specialized for certain specific modes of use. For example, large wings are suitable for soaring. This is a picture of an albatross, which has the largest wingspan of any bird, and it's capable of soaring for extended periods of time. Soaring is when you fly for a long time without flapping. Small wings, on the other hand, are suitable for flapping because they're so small, they don't take a lot of energy to move them, but that also means that they need to be in motion constantly to keep the bird airborne. The hummingbird famously flaps its wings so quickly that they're a blur in any picture not taken with a high-speed camera, and they make a humming sound, which is obviously why they're called hummingbirds. So wings are studied extensively for aeronautical engineering. The idea being that birds have figured out how to fly. If we want to fly, we should learn how did they do it. And we can actually take some pointers from the way that bird wings are built to improve how airplane wings are built. For example, bird wings have what's called an alula. These are feathers on the front of the wings that break up turbulence when landing and prevent stalling when flying slowly or hovering. Turns out that on the front of a wing, as that runs into the air, that's likely to cause some turbulence that can cause unpredictable motion in your wing and therefore in your airplane. Birds have feathers on the front of the wing that break up that turbulence, and by breaking the wind up actually help them to cut more smoothly through the air, and we've managed to incorporate that into the design of airplane wings. Their skeletons are also designed for flight in that they are full of air-filled cavities. This helps them to be lighter and stronger so that you can be able to be lightweight and fly and not be weighed down by a heavy skeleton, but not also have such a weak skeleton that you break your bones every time you land. The bones are full of air-filled cavities that are reinforced with thin strands of bone tissue. You can almost picture it like it's columns, like supporting columns in a large room, or maybe like spokes in a wheel. Less mass, more support. Okay, so now that we've talked about the primary characteristics of class Aves of the birds, let's talk about some specific orders. Here come the big Latin words that I'm hopefully not going to butcher. I promise. I looked these up before I did this lesson, tried pronouncing them. They're a beast. Let's try it. So let's start with the flightless birds. The Struthioniforms are ostriches. That would also include birds like emus and cassowaries. Then we have the Spheniciforms, which are the penguins. Now, in these two orders of class Aves, the bones are not porous like the flightless birds' bones are. And in some cases, for example, the penguins, they use wings as flippers instead of for flight. Now, if you are not flying, then the advantage of having lightweight bones doesn't serve you. It only makes your bones weaker. If you're going to be a tough savanna bird like an ostrich, it helps to have strong bones so that you can live that rough life. And as far as penguins go, really it's just a matter of buoyancy. Birds of prey include falconiforms, which would include eagles, falcons, and hawks. And then the strigiforms, which are the owls. These are both considered birds of prey in that they are carnivorous predatory birds. They both have those sharp hooked bills, which we would just call a beak. And then also they have sharp, powerful claws on their feet called talons. We have another list of orders that are a bit more varied. The Phoenicopteriforms, which are the flamingos, Apodiforms, which are hummingbirds, and those are fairly well understood groups, but one that might stand a little bit of detail would be the Galliforms. A good example of Galliforms would be quail, although chickens and turkeys are also part of this order. So what makes this order unique is that their flight muscles tire out quickly because they're not very well supplied with oxygen. As you know, oxygen is important in metabolism. They're part of what your mitochondria need to produce usable energy. And so if you don't have a good oxygen supply to your muscles, then they run out of energy very quickly. Since their muscles tire easily, then they're not constantly worked out. It keeps them tender. So they have these large pectoral muscles, which we would call like a chicken breast, that are really nice to eat, and so that's why they are prime targets for hunting. Okay, So, moving on, we have some water-dwelling birds. For example, the anseriforms. That would include ducks, swans, and geese. These are also swimming birds, and they are adapted with bills suitable for eating food that is both in the water and not in the water, but also with webbed feet for swimming. There are some other water-dwelling birds, the pelicaniforms. Obviously, this would be groups like pelicans. These are diving birds that don't just swim on top of the water, sometimes going bottoms up so they can reach down in the water with their necks like swans, ducks, and geese. In fact, these birds will dive and go under the water to catch some prey like fish. Another water-dwelling bird are the Ceconiiforms, which would include a heron, and these are birds that are wading birds. These birds live around where we live, including the great blue heron, and sometimes you can see them flying overhead, their long legs trailing behind them, their long necks sticking out in front of them. They're quite a sight to see. Then we have the songbirds. This is the last order that we're going to look at today. They're called Passeriforms. And what makes songbirds unique is that they have an organ that other animals do not. It is called a syrinx. And this is the organ that makes chirping possible. Now, just to compare that with our physiology, what makes our voice possible? Well, that would be what's called your voice box or your larynx. And it's kind of easy to see on me. It's this thing commonly called the Adam's apple, and it's sticking out of my throat like a sore thumb. What that is a little cavern made out of cartilage that contains a couple flaps that, kind of like the reed on a saxophone or like the rubber band on like a rubber band guitar, flops around in the breeze whenever I blow out and have the tension in my throat just right. Well, what that does is it produces a sound which I can then modulate with my mouth and my face and all that stuff to produce my voice. So lots of animals have those. That's what wolves would howl with. That's what animals who have a vocalization that resembles ours would produce it with. Now, birds that produce their chirping sound, that is not a voice like we have. Instead, they have something that resembles a different kind of musical instrument, and that makes chirping possible. Now, in our next lesson, we're going to focus on chirping as a phenomenon, and that is going to be really enjoyable. It totally just made my day when I first learned about it earlier this year, and I'm really excited to share it with you. So stay tuned for that, and we're going to really have a good time. Anyway, that's all for now, and I guess if you ask me, birds are pretty fly.